This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited Magic. We're still talking about Edge of Eternities. We're in the early days of the format still, even though we've also gotten a bunch of previews for the next two sets. The fact remains that this is the only one we're going to have for a while. You may have noticed things look a little bit different behind me. That's because we are in the process of moving. This will either be the last or second to last Nitsa Notes where this is what the stuff behind me looks like. Anyway, in today's video, I'm going to do what I always do at this stage of the format. I'm going to look at cards that are being taken too early based on how they're actually performing. Basically, these are cards that are overrated significantly and shouldn't be valued as highly as they are. As usual, I'm going to be using 17 Lands data. You can check them out at 17lands.com. You can sign up to have them track your data, and it gives us a really big picture look at limited formats where we get a feeling for what's actually happening in the format beyond our own personal experience, which, you know, personal experience matters to an extent, but you have to get a lot of reps before it really matters in a game with as much variance as Magic does, and 17 Lands gives us a way to see the result of all those reps, and that is a useful thing to have. I always like to use a baseline card to sort of give us a feeling for how things are looking in the format, what the data means, and stuff like that. So this time around, we're going to look at Hull Carver. This is the classic kind of card that I think we can all agree is like pretty good, and you're going to play them in your deck, but they're not great, and that's really what the data tells us. It has a win rate of 55.7%. And remember, on 17 Lands, the average win rate is higher than it is in the whole community collectively. It would be 50% if it was everybody, right? But 17 Lands users are at 54.8% for this particular format, and that means a card like Hull Carver, which would look really good if the overall win rate was 50%, is just like a solid card with its 55.7% win rate, and it's being taken around an 8th pick, and I think it's a kind of card that is being taken exactly where it should be. It has useful type for, you know, the black artifact decks, but it's also just an okay one-drop pretty much everywhere because it can trade for anything and stuff like that. So 1-mana 1/1 Death Touchers are pretty much always in this category of like solid, but not great, and that's certainly what Hull Carver is. But what we're going to see on this list is that all the cards on it are being taken earlier, but they're all substantially worse than it is in terms of their overall win rate. Now, remember, data is not the end-all be-all. You shouldn't just take cards based on what has the highest game-in-hand win rate on 17 Lands. Your actual draft matters. There are individual decks where some of these cards can be significantly better than they are when looking at the grand scheme of things. You know, looking at so many drafts at the same time has some disadvantages too, because there are occasionally decks where things can work out for some of these cards. But for the most part, they're all cards that are at the very least being taken way too early, and at worst are pretty close to unplayable or entirely unplayable, really. So let's go ahead and dive in. So let's start with the card that is perhaps the most surprising to see on this list, just when you look at your typical limited format, and that's Bombard. So it has a win rate of 54.1%, and it's being taken around pick 5.7. So that is not a great win rate for a card that is normally like a premium removal. Like you'd expect this to be at least in the 56 range in this format, but it's not particularly good, and there are a few reasons for that. It is like 3-mana deal 4 is a lot less good than it used to be. For one thing, I mean, there are a lot of creatures now that you have to kill with this that are around the same cost or sometimes cheaper because they've given us so many decent and better like 1-mana and 2-mana creatures that are scary. And when you're overspending to kill those, that really does hurt your development in a particular game. And then it's in sort of a weird no man's land because then there's all these things that are bigger than it that it just can't kill. And once you're spending 3 mana, you kind of wish it could kill some of the bigger stuff a little more efficiently. And it's really interesting because, you know, red is probably the weakest color in the format, and that hurts Bombard's stats. Like if red was great beyond Bombard, it would be pulled up by having other good red cards. But it's important to note that the other two common removal spells, the 1-mana deal 2 that turns into a deal 3 when you have Void, and Orbital Plunge, the 4-mana deal 6, usually you get a lander, those are both performing better, and I think there's a lot of reason for that. For one thing, 1 mana to deal 2 is already the kind of thing that can let you trade up even in a format like this one. So that ends up being fine. But the 1 mana deal 3 really allows you to trade up. And it's just way more efficient than Bombard is. I mean, you can often cast it for 2 less mana to get 1 fewer damage. Like, if you just think of it that way, you can see the gap between the two. And sure, it's a sorcery, that hurts it some, but it's pretty good. And it can also hit players. Like, I'm sure at this point we've all lost to that like void lightning bolt in the format, or won with it, or both. But it is interesting that those two both have much higher win rates, especially Orbital Plunge, which is just an amazing common. I gave both Bombard and Orbital Plunge C pluses in my set review, but in the end, I think Bombard is more like a C minus, which is really surprising. The other two cards just have so much more upside because of being able to hit the opponent, and because of the 2-for-1 you get, because you get a lander most of the time. So, and 2-for-1s are really important in every format, but in this format, they seem really important. Like, anything that impacts the board and also gives you an extra card of value is good, basically, in this format. Whereas a lot of cards that don't add to the board and can maybe give you a 2-for-1 aren't nearly as good. And Bombard is never going to be a 2-for-1 unless you really get them on a trick. But at this point, we mostly know that tricks aren't that good in the format, apart from basically the common green one. So it's not really the kind of thing that blows out tricks very often either. So Bombard ends up being shockingly subpar, and it should definitely not be getting taken around pick 5.74, which is, again, higher than the other two common red removal spells. And I think that's because people, it looks like it's going to be really good, but the other two are just better. All right, let's look now at Sammy's Curiosity. So almost every card in the set that makes a lander is good, or, at least solid or better. Not this one so much. So it's not terrible, and this is one you end up playing in decks that are really heavy on landers, really heavy on needing fixing and ramping and stuff. Like, you can still play it, but it doesn't perform nearly as well as the other lander cards. So it has a win rate of 53.9%, and it's being taken around pick 7.26. And it has kind of the same problem as Bombard. Like, it doesn't really, it's never going to generate more than a card worth of value. Like, the 2 life plus the lander doesn't even itself feel that much like it's worth a card. Like, it feels pretty disappointing. And it's not terrible in your opening hand, but drawing Sammy's Curiosity late is often, like, terrible. Like, if you have some landfall in play, maybe it helps you go off and swing with your whole board with the big Leviathan guy, right? But there are lots of situations where it's just not a good draw, and it just doesn't do enough. Whereas, like, cards like the 3-mana 3/3 that makes a lander, like, it's the same sort of thing as I was talking about that Bombard isn't, which is a card that adds to the board and generates more than a card worth of value. Sammy's Curiosity is kind of the same. It doesn't really add to the board for the most part, and it doesn't really feel like it generates even a full card of value most of the time. Like, it's close. And then it's a pretty bad top deck in the late game. So you'd much rather, like in the later stages of the game, where you'd much rather just have the 3-mana 3/3 guy, for example. But, there are a bunch of other better lander cards too. And Sammy's Curiosity isn't really one that you should prioritize when you're in that kind of deck. There are plenty of other good ones around. Also just playing the 1-mana 1/2 who can tap for mana of any color when you tap something else in this slot is just way better too, because you get a body, you get ramp, you get fixing. It's an artifact. Like, there's just so much going on there that makes it better than, like, the full value you get out of Sammy's Curiosity. So that's another common that's, like, similar and just way better at the same mana value too. So yeah, playing one of these in your deck that is going crazy, like in blue-green with ramp and landfall, it's fine. But it's going to be one of the worst cards in your deck. It's going to be like your 23rd card. And it's really the only deck you should play it in is one that is really going wild with all that landfall. And even there, I think it's, like I said, a 23rd card, one of the last cards to make the cut. All right, let's talk about Dawnstrike Vanguard. I talked about this last week and how I was way off about it. Like, I thought it was going to be a quality card for a lot of decks in the format. But it is still being taken way too highly and has a pretty bad win rate. So it's at 5.53 and has a win rate of 52.4%. And the Vanguard is kind of a stand-in for, like, every card in the set that says when you have 2 or more creatures tapped, something good happens. There are some exceptions, especially at higher rarities, but basically all the common and uncommon cards that have those lines of text on them just aren't good enough. Going into the set, a lot of us, including obviously myself, since it was on my What I Got Wrong video, we thought you'd be able to trigger this once often enough for it to be good enough, like that it would just work out. But you just don't. Like, and triggering it once usually is enough, it's true, and there are games that it takes over, but there are just so many board states out there where you just can't do that. Like, it's not automatic. You know, most decks are playing like 1 to 2 spacecraft for the most part, because a lot of the lower rarity ones aren't great. So you don't end up having the ability to tap them easily like all the time. And you also don't just attack your opponent in such a way that you're in a good spot to trigger this. And then, like, there are white decks in the format that are good, but they're not really interested in a 6-drop. You know, like the green-white deck is an aggro deck that puts counters everywhere. This puts counters on things. But if that deck hasn't won by like turn 6 most of the time, it's going to lose to the grindier decks in the format. And it can't really afford to do that. It needs to be in a really good position. And then once you're in that position, you'd much rather have like a removal spell to kill your opponent's blocker and just attack them. So, you know, the Dawnstrike Vanguard, you know, being taken around pick 5.53 with this 52.4% win rate, it's just way too high. It doesn't really fit very well into the white decks in the format because they're either interested in really cheap spells like blue-white or kind of aggressive like green-white, and the red-white color pair, because it's based on this exact mechanic of having 2 things tap, as a whole is kind of a dud. And the Vanguard isn't one of these cards that can elevate that kind of deck really, just because it's so inefficient too. I mean, you know, people play this and then have it killed by Orbital Plunge for 4 mana a lot before they ever get any counters, and that is like pretty close to a game-losing play just because of the amount of value you lost and the amount of mana your opponent's saving and the amount of value they get too. So yeah, bad stats, doesn't really fit very well into the format, and is based around a mechanic that is not a major part of what this format is actually about, even though they tried to design it that way. Let's look now at Steel Swarm Operator. So this is being taken around pick 6.23 and it has a win rate of 52.6%. So generally, like, you know, I was just talking about how all the cards that say something on them about having 2 things tapped not being good, most of the cards in the set that say something about having an artifact around or doing artifact payoff things are pretty good. Like, not all of them. There's like the 3 mana 1/4 that gets +1/+0, and the 4 mana 3/4 that gets +1/+0 in Death Touch. Neither of those are that good. You know, just like stats creatures like that aren't that great. But most of the other artifact payoffs in the set are, and going an artifact route in blue-black, for example, you end up in a pretty strong deck most of the time. But this isn't really part of what you want to do. Like most 2 mana 1/1s, like, you need to get something out of it right away to overcome the fact that it is such a meager body. Like, if you play this on 2, it can feel okay. You might be able to attack your opponent or ramp into some artifact, but the problem is this format has so much cheap, efficient removal that your opponent killing this for 1 mana is bad news generally. Like, you know, you're going down a mana essentially in that exchange, and usually taking some damage at the same time. And you just end up not having the time to use it all that much to produce mana for your artifact stuff. Now, again, I'm not saying this never happens, and no one has ever won with Steel Swarm Operator, right? It doesn't have a 0% win rate, but you know, draft in and draft out, you'll find that its meager body, which is really only worthwhile in the early game, is hard to keep around, hard to take advantage of. And then as a late game or even mid game card, it's not very good either. Like, you really need things that impact the board more. You know, this format just has so many like lower rarity cards that generate 2-for-1s, that cards that like can give you a mana advantage while having bad stats, just they're not really what you want to be doing. And even in this set with an artifact theme, this is still pretty restrictive about what it lets you spend mana on. So it ends up not being very good. Certainly not a card you should take around pick 6.2. All right, let's look now at a trio of uncommons that are all pretty bad. A couple of them I think I'd say are downright horrible, but are being taken really high. And those are Galvanizing Sawship, Rescue Skiff, and Atmospheric Greenhouse. So the Greenhouse is a card I talked about last week in my What I Got Wrong video. Just like people who are playing still are taking it around pick 4.73. I thought it was going to be really good. Like green's best uncommon good, gave it a B in the set review. It is not. It's not good at all. And I include the Saw Ship and the Rescue Skiff here because they kind of have the same problem. So there are a lot of spacecraft in this format that are good. Don't get me wrong. About half of them, I think, are pretty good. Especially the higher rarity ones. You mostly can't go wrong with those, other than the 5-color one and stuff. But most of them at the higher rarities are quite good. And there are good uncommon ones, too, which is a bummer for these three. Because other cards in this cycle, like Fell Graveship especially, is really good. There's also another green uncommon one that does the sack a land or a land or grab 2 lands. That's really good. So there are good spacecraft around. And I'm going deep on this a little bit because I've seen a lot of people say spacecraft are just bad. You shouldn't play them. They're too slow. That's not quite true. There are some that it's true of, though. And that's what these three are. So we'll start with the greenhouse since I already touched on it last week. My big mistake there, I was thinking of it as a card that, I thought a lot of these vehicles, if they add to the board immediately and then can later become creatures, would be good enough. But the problem with the greenhouse is that it's like double bad in the situation where you don't have a board. Like all of the spacecraft, most of them aren't great when you have an empty board because it's harder to get them going, right? But the ones that are really good give you some sort of effect even when you have an empty board right away, like the Grav ship that I mentioned. However, the problem with the greenhouse is that it needs a board for its enters trigger to matter too. And so that makes it really narrow. Are there games where you play the greenhouse, buffs your whole board, you immediately turn it into a creature and you win on the next turn? Absolutely. However, they're not happening very often because you need to have the exact right kind of board for that to happen. And it's being taken the highest of these three at pick 4.73. Like, that's where you pick one of the best uncommons in the set, right? But it has a 50.5% win rate, which is very bad. It's pretty close to a card you just shouldn't play. You're going to have those turns where it does something really amazing, but you're going to have even more where you're like, I'm paying 5 for 2 counters. I can't really tap these creatures right now to station it. So I guess this is what my turn is. And those turns happen a lot and they don't feel good at all. Let's look now at Rescue Skiff, the white uncommon. So made kind of the same mistake here. It is better. It has a win rate of 52.7%. So it's like a D instead of an F like the greenhouse is. And it's being taken around pick 5.8. This one does add to the board, but it's also conditional in what it adds to the board because you have to have a thing to get back. And in my head, in the set review, like this is another one I overrated. I overrated all 3 of these. And so are people collectively, and that's why I'm talking about them. And the skiff, I imagined it reanimating something significant and then maybe being able to help station it. But like all reanimation effects, which if you in every limited format, if you just assumed every reanimation card was a D or worse, you'd be right more often than you're wrong. And Rescue Skiff is another one of those. It's just highly situational to actually have something, even as expensive as this is. It's situational for you to have something. Doesn't help that there's a 3-mana 3/1 in the format that exiles graveyards at lower rarities. That's also a good card because it makes a lander. All of those make these cards worse. But the skiff ends up just not getting something meaningful back enough of the time, and then it's very hard to station. It's also really expensive for a card that is this situational, and it's kind of in the same spot as Dawnstrike Vanguard. Like, this isn't what white's doing in the format. It's an aggressive color for the most part. You want to double spell, cast cheap things, or put counters on things with Holia. You want to curve out. This thing just doesn't make very much sense. And the format as a whole does not have much of a graveyard theme either. So, especially outside of black-green. So, you end up not being able to do something meaningful with it enough of the time. The worst of these 3, though, is Galvanizing Saw Ship. So it has a win rate of 49.8%. It's also being taken lower than the other 2 at pick 6.75. I didn't like this one certainly not as much as the greenhouse and not as much as the skiff either in the set review. But just like people who are playing the format right now are taking it too early, I thought it was going to be better than it is. Because while it doesn't technically have an interest trigger or add to the board, I imagined being able to tap your creature, one thing, and turn it into a 6/5 and smash in with it right away. Like, I saw that happening a lot and being a good play, but it turns out it's just not most of the time. It actually reminds me a lot of another card I overrated, and I overrated this one by a lot. There was a vehicle in Aether Drift called Spire Mech Cycle that similarly was like a creature that couldn't be a creature on its own, but it was a haste creature at a higher mana value. This one cost 5. And then you tapped something else to put a counter on it and permanently have it become a creature. You could also accrue it for 2. And I thought this was going to be really good because I just thought it would be kind of automatic that you'd just be able to play this, do the thing, tap it and exhaust it, and then attack your opponent with this creature that's pretty efficient for the cost. Like, I just saw that happening a lot. But it turns out that it is real setup to have to tap a significant creature to get this thing going. And then all you've got is a beater. And it dies to tons of cheap removal in the format. And at least, it has flying unlike Spire Mech Cycle, I guess. But even getting in with 6 for it doesn't feel that good on a lot of board states because suddenly you're defenseless. And the chances your opponent can untap and cast one of a plethora of removal spells, all of which feel really good against it because it costs 6 mana. It just ends up not working out often at all, and it's not a good card. The haste flying thing kind of had me thinking it would feel like it has an interest trigger because you'll hit your opponent, but the setup, just like on the mech cycle, ends up being big enough that it ends up not mattering that it's a reasonably efficient creature. And, again, like I've been saying, this format is kind of like a 2-for-1 format, and this isn't a card that does that at all. It's just a creature with stats, and that's it. All right, let's look at Emergency Eject now. So, the Stroke of Midnight-like effect ends up showing up in every one of these cards are overrated videos. Usually, however, the card is doing way worse. Like Stroke of Midnight is like a 49% win rate or whatever. This at least has a 53.5% win rate, but it's being taken around pick 5.4. And I did like this more than I like most of these kinds of effects. So typically those cards aren't good in 40-card limited formats because the targets you have for them aren't worth enough to make it worth giving your opponent back a card. Like, that's basically what it comes down to. If everyone was playing bombs and stuff, like in Commander, where so many creatures are must-kill threats, and you don't care if you give your opponent a 1/1 in place of it because you have this super flexible removal spell, like, that's one thing. But that's not limited. Like, casting something like this on a 3/3, which you have to do in limited, feels terrible. And the reason Emergency Eject is better than Stroke of Midnight and the like is because at least if you're in like a hyper-aggressive deck, you can cast this, kill something, and that's one less blocker, right? The problem with Stroke of Midnight is you give your opponent a 1/1. And so at a minimum, it can chump block, and sometimes it can even trade for some of your stuff, in which case you really just 2-for-1 yourself. And Emergency Eject can 2-for-1 you as well. It gives your opponent a lander, but it does take long enough, and they have to do something extra to get that value, and it's a value that never adds to the board in terms of non-land permanence anyway. So it ends up being an okay card, and I thought it would be okay in the set review. I gave it like a C. Maybe it's more like a C-, a little worse than I expected, but it's definitely not pick 5.4 material. I think a lot of people, they play Commander and other formats where there are lots of powerful targets for a card like this, and they think it's going to be really good because it's flexible, only costs 3. But I can guarantee you that like 80% of targets for Emergency Eject and the like, well, less so for Emergency Eject, 80% of targets for Stroke of Midnight, let's say, maybe even 90, aren't going to feel good when you kill them. Emergency Eject, it's a little higher, like for all the reasons that I mentioned. It's going to work out maybe half the time. It ends up feeling okay instead of terrible. But it still has the same problems. It's not a removal spell you should prioritize ever. Banishing Light is a million times better in limited than a card like this is, even though it's not an instant and stuff. It has its own downsides, but it doesn't give your opponent a whole card of value, unlike this. So definitely not pick 5.4 material, but it is playable, unlike Stroke of Midnight and the like. All right, let's finish things off here with Hymn of the Faller. So this is at a win rate of 51.9%, and it's taken around pick 5.98. So this is one that I did think was going to be better in the set review. I wasn't super high on it. However, I imagined it being 2 mana draw 2 often enough for it to be fine. Like, I thought that would be okay. You know, if you can do that a decent chunk of the time, it's going to be good. But overall, it's kind of hard to trigger void consistently enough for this to do its thing. Like, especially because, you know, one of the nice things about like creatures with void is that in a sense, or any permanent with void that can give itself up, is that in a sense they synergize with your other void stuff, right? Because you can do something to get rid of them to get void going. But then when you're running a bunch of spells with void, which you don't want to use those sorts of slots on a card like this when you've got Tragic Trajectory and the 1 mana Void Lightning Bolt I was talking about earlier, like those are worthwhile payoffs for doing it, and they're cheaper, 1 mana. But Hymn of the Faller just ends up drawing you 1 card a lot of the time, and that's just not good enough in today's limited. You know, I've talked about there once was a time where if a card had it replaced itself, like that alone was like, well, the floor is that it replaces itself. It can't be that bad. But we've reached a point now where spending mana for a card to just replace itself ends up not being good enough. Like, we've seen that time and time again. Like, look at all the land cyclers we've seen lately. Most of them aren't very good unless the land cycling is 1. So those sorts of effects just aren't enough anymore. They don't add to the board. Dawnstrike Vanguard, or rather, Hymn of the Faller doesn't add to the board either. And it's very hard to draw 2 with it. If it always drew 2, it'd have a much higher win rate. Like, once you're drawing 2, it becomes worth it to not add to the board. That's a 2-for-1 after all. But the fail case here is bad, and the fail case is what you get a lot of the time, and it's a clunky card when you're not able to get void going. All right, so those are the cards I wanted to cover. The overrated cards, you know, stuck to commons and uncommons because that matters the most. The overrated cards in Edge of Eternities. Next week, we'll look at the opposite. We'll look at cards that are being underrated and not being taken highly enough, given how they're actually performing in the format. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to make sure you are all caught up on my content for this format, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.